Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
That is a story I love. And oddly, as with everything else, I'm beginning to wonder, I sort of see Brexit everywhere. Like that kid in the Sixth Sense. I see Brexit. Because, of course, I've said to you many times that if a lot of the rhetoric of the last few years had been uttered in normal accents as opposed to pantomime toffs and sort of comedy patrician accents with a side order of cod Latin, then the British public, the great British public, would have seen through it a lot quicker. But we are where we are. And where are we today? We need a bit of Theo Usherwood at some point, I think, just to talk us through the programme of events that is stretching out in front of us. But in many ways, and it is a very unhappy observation, but in many ways this is all inevitable, and it kind of had to come to this. What is left? Well, the customs border in the Irish Sea, which of course Boris Johnson swore blind he would never do. The delay request submitted to the European Union, which Boris Johnson swore blind he would never do. And now we find ourselves faced with, I think, let's just rush it through, and then we can say we've done it, which is, needless to say, not true. Cessation of this period of squabbling would begin a period of squabbling on a scale that this country has never seen before. I don't know whether it's true or not yet, but I've seen it suggested by some very trustworthy characters, so I shall share it with you with that caveat. But legislation addressing the welfare of 19 specific circus animals took a lot longer to get through the House of Commons than Boris Johnson is seeking to push through what I'm going to describe as the single most complicated and significant legislative process that this country has ever seen. I mean, I'd love to do a phone-in on that, actually, but I haven't got the history. I'm embarrassed. Well, not embarrassed, nobody's perfect. I haven't got the history, I'm sorry to say, and I'm certainly not going to indulge in some sort of Rees-Moggian pretense where I read the first line of a chapter and claim to have fully absorbed all of it, or I throw out something I've got from the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations in the hope that you'll believe I've read the entire book. But I can't quite conceive of anything more significant than this. And this will determine elements of our country's future that will resonate for generations to come. Not what happens today. What happens today opens the door to it. What happens subsequently will take years, possibly even decades, to be properly resolved. And it's terrifying on one level, and it's even more terrifying on another level. The level on which it's even more terrifying is the recognition level, which is this. The minute you write it down, it falls apart, okay? So what has been written down today contains next to nothing with regard to our future relationships. Because if it did, then people would understandably say, hang on a minute, I've read that, that's much worse than what we've got now. So don't write that down. Just call it and force it through, because people are impatient or they've had enough. This is, in many ways, the crux of the con. And I know that many people still don't feel that they were conned, and that's fine. I mean, that's human nature. Of course, people don't feel that they were conned. That's why we've got £350 million in our back pocket every week to give to the NHS. It's why last week the German car industry put the chokers on Angela Merkel and made her give the British government trading terms that the British government simply demanded. It's why. Do you know there's even a line in this thing that goes into Parliament today? There's even a line in it that David Allen Green, the legal commentator, has picked apart quite perfectly, because it proves that Parliament, and I know half the people listening to this already know this and the other half still deny it, but it's right there in black and white. Parliament is and always has been sovereign. That's an astonishing, for those of us who like facts, that's an astonishing episode in this ridiculous saga. It was never true that we had surrendered or lost our sovereignty. If you and I begin a negotiation together, and I begin from the position where I want you to do everything I want, regardless of whether or not it damages you or not, and you begin from a position where you want me to fall in line completely with your plans, regardless of whether or not they are what I want or whether or not I'm going to be damaged by it, then the only way sovereignty played a part in this whole ridiculous debate was using it as a word to describe compromise. So here's me and here's you. I want 100% and I want you to have 0. You want 100% and you want me to have 0. For the purposes of argument, we end up agreeing on 50% each, right? And that is a pooling of sovereignty. In other words, if you want sovereignty in the sense that some of these headbangers used it in the run-up to the vote, then it means the whole world will have to do what we tell them. Good luck with that. So there's a line in this legislation that goes through Parliament today that absolutely nails it. Quite unbelievable that we're still having these conversations after 4 years, still talking about sovereignty. And the other element that is frightening, as opposed to even more frightening than frightening about this, is how transparent it all is. How many times have we sat here and said the minute you write it down, it falls apart? The minute they're asked properly to explain, most obviously, and you could be forgiven for having forgotten that this is an important element of the conversation, could you please explain how this is better than what we've currently got? Oh, no, that argument was over in 2016. Yeah, but all the explanations you gave about how we'd be better than what we've currently got have turned out not to be true, lads. Well, I think you just need to shut up and trust Boris Johnson. Trust who? Boris Johnson. So I'm often intrigued by the question of what has Brexit boiled down to. And it's boiled down to pass this without having enough detail to be able to properly scrutinise it, and trust Boris Johnson. Just think about that for a minute. He led a campaign that was found to have broken electoral law. There's some very, very big questions still to be answered about that process, not least why it wasn't properly investigated, although, of course, the answer to that can be found in the personnel list in Theresa May's Downing Street, many of whom now have knighthoods and peerages and sundry other gongs. The likelihood of that outfit properly investigating the vehicle that drove a coach and horses through evidence-based politics and fact-based journalism was always going to be pretty slim. So we know, I appreciate not everybody sets as much weight by personal life as I do in life, and I don't necessarily think that I'm right to do so. Other European countries pay very, very little attention to the domestic arrangements of their leaders. France, most obviously. I think Francois Mitterrand had a daughter by a mistress that the media all knew about and didn't report until he was dead. Did that impact upon Francois Mitterrand's effectiveness as a politician? I don't know. To me, it would be a trust issue. But that is, just think about this for a minute, because it's if this was happening in another country, I once would have said we'd be laughing our socks off. But, last week Donald Trump tried to award the G7 summit to one of his own resorts, which has a well-documented problem with bed bugs. To one of his own resorts. Even his slavish supporters in the Republican Party have balked at trying to defend that pocket-lining exercise. So I don't know that we would necessarily laugh at other countries indulging in such ridiculous practices. The fundamental essence of everything that's happened over the last 4 years has now boiled down to just trust Boris Johnson. Don't look under the bonnet. Trust the man selling you this car. So I'm sticking with that analogy, by the way, because the whole point about what he's trying to push through Parliament in the next 3 days is that it's all paint job and no engine. Don't look under the bonnet. We will sort out the bonnet once you've bought what's under the bonnet, once you've bought the car. That's what's happening, as I understand it, over the next 3 days. They're going to desperately try to sell you this car or to sell Parliament this car. And all Parliament can really see is the outside, the paint job, the electric windows, All of that. No one's allowed to lift the bonnet on it, okay? Because the minute you lift the bonnet, problems would begin. The minute you write it down, it all falls apart. So, astonishingly, we find ourselves being asked to entrust the future of our nation to a man who couldn't lie straight in bed. In fact, that's not fair, because, of course, Boris Johnson regularly spends time in several beds in a single day. So we find ourselves contemplating now a country poised upon the brink of epochal change, almost all of which has been adjudged by those who know of which they speak to be negative. Amber Rudd saying, we're looking at a hit 5 to 6% of the economy, but I'm going to vote for it. Sajid Javid saying, we haven't done any economic impact assessments for this, but we're going to vote for it. We are essentially being told, right, to close our eyes and step off a precipice and to put our trust in Boris Johnson. I still can't see how anyone can hear those words and not feel a frisson of fear. Has Boris Johnson ever kept a promise in his life? 0345 6060 973. And the second question for this morning's entertainment is this. How has it come to this? How, after tracking this stuff painstakingly, after pointing out at every turn how fundamentally unreliable the architects of this con are, there's a simple observation yesterday about how there was no earthly way that the two wings could ever be given something they could agree on. That's what you're seeing when the DUP and the ERG end up on different sides of the division lobby. All these moments at which I thought once everybody would eventually feel the scales fall from their eyes. We will never abandon the DUP, said the men who abandoned the DUP on Saturday. So that mess, that unholy mess, has led us to a point where we as a country are being asked, don't look behind the curtain. Just put your trust in the great and wonderful Wizard of Oz. 0345 6060 973. Tell me why you trust Boris Johnson, despite all the evidence to the contrary. I'd love to hear from either of his ex-wives, any of his mistresses, why you still trust him. Mother singular of his love child. Love to hear from any of those people. Why do you still trust Boris Johnson? Because I wouldn't trust him as far as I could throw him. And I can't quite understand how anybody could. But that's what the country has been reduced to by 4 years of misinformation, lies, false equivalence and ludicrous attempts at balance. Here we are, standing atop an enormous tower with no parachute and apparently no safety net. But we can all jump with our eyes shut because Boris Johnson is such a stand-up, straight-talking, trustworthy kind of guy. Wow. So, why do you trust Boris Johnson, given that he has lied to you again and again and again? And Brexit has boiled down, as perhaps it was always destined to do so, given the incredibly complicated nature of our right-wing newspapers' relationship with the truth, to this simple request. Do you trust Boris Johnson? To which my question today is, can you tell me a promise that he's ever kept? 0345 6060 973. Muffy is in Fulham. Muffy, what would you like to say?
Good morning, Nick. I'd like to start
That's
off by
a good
saying
start.
that
It's James here, Muffy. I don't know if you want to review your position.
Review it on what?
You seem to have rung the wrong show. Let me guess, you're pro-Brexit and pro-Boris Johnson.
No, I want to talk about Boris and his wives and mothers, etc., that you've just been talking about.
Yes. Go on, then.
Well, I just have to start by saying that I'm obviously not his mother. I'm not one of his former wives or present wives, and I'm certainly not the mother of his love child. However, I do believe he can get Brexit finished on the 31st of October.
So, when you use the word Brexit in that context, what do you mean?
I mean that it'll be the end of our official membership of the EU, which we have belonged to for 46 years.
And how long will we be under their rules and regulations for?
Hopefully for as short a time as possible.
Hang on, you said hopefully. Hopefully. I was looking for something a little more substantive than that.
Well, I haven't seen, obviously, the deal or anything like it. None of us have.
Then why do you want it, then?
None of us knows what's going to happen in Parliament in the next 3 days.
No, but the deal, as you say, you have no idea what's in it, but you're certain that you want it.
We have got to get out of the EU.
But why do you want a deal that you don't know the contents of?
Well, you keep talking about the bonnet and what's underneath it.
Well, we don't have to do that if you don't want to. Just talk about the deal and what's in it.
Not understand what's underneath the bonnet and still have a wonderful car.
Yes.
As it turns out, I do know what's under the bonnet.
Oh, good. What's in the deal?
I think there's a lot of stuff that's very good for the UK.
For example?
And it would seem, from what you've said so far this morning,
for example,
that you are very anti-government and anti-Brexit.
For example? Well, in the deal, the stuff that you think is very good for the UK.
Sorry, it's a bad line. I couldn't quite hear that.
All the stuff in the deal that is, in your words, very good for the UK. If
the deal goes through and we get our independence on the 31st of October,
yes,
we will remain
the
friends
stuff, forgive
with
me,
Europe as we have to.
I'm so sorry for interrupting you, but you said there's lots of stuff in the deal that is very good for the UK. I just wondered if you could run us through maybe the top 10.
Well, obviously, I haven't read it all. None of us have.
Okay, the top one.
But as far as I can see, generally, from what we're reading in the press, we will have a good relationship with Europe. We will be trading with Europe. We'll be allowed to trade worldwide.
I hate to break this to you, but if we were to leave the European Union on October the 31st, then within a year we could have no trading agreements whatsoever with the European Union. But I don't want to overcomplicate things. You were fairly clear that there's stuff
You are being very biased, Nick.
No,
you say these things yourself, and you have no idea that that's going to happen.
Yes, I do, though.
What do you mean you know?
No, I do know that that's a possibility.
It's a possibility,
yes,
of course.
But you know that there's stuff in the deal that's good for the UK because you've read it in the paper, so I just want you to tell my listeners what it is.
Well, I've already listed a few.
You haven't. You haven't listed a single thing that's contained within the legislation that's going before Parliament.
Independent country.
Yes, we already are.
Look, you are interrupting me all the time.
Yes, because you're not saying anything.
When you don't like what somebody is saying.
It's not that I don't like what you're saying. It's that what you're saying is gibberish, and I like my listeners too much to allow them to absorb it uninterrupted. So once again, you said, I think you'll remember this, you said there's lots of stuff in the deal that's very good for the UK because you'd read it in the papers, and I've asked you to name one thing that's written down that you believe to be good for the UK. I asked for 10 things, but I am being greedy, Muffy, so I will accept one thing right now, live on the radio.
We will be able to trade with not only Europe, but also the whole world as an independent nation.
Okay, and that's written down in the deal, is it?
I have no idea, but that's the idea behind
Muffy,
it all.
finally you've said something true. Say it again.
What would you like me to say again?
I have no idea.
Well, I've said it all the time. I've said it several times.
I could not agree with you more. Thank you for the call. It's Nick here, expressing enormous gratitude for your contribution to this programme. And there it is, the voice of Brexit. I have no idea. Tony's in Horsham. Do you trust Boris Johnson?
I trust Boris Johnson as much as I trusted Tony Blair when he told us there were weapons of mass destruction that could be activated within 45 minutes in Iraq.
So that's relevant. That's relevant. So definitely you don't trust Boris Johnson at all, then?
Well, it's not just Boris Johnson. I don't think governments have any obligation to tell us the truth. They seem to me to be actors on a stage. And do we expect actors to tell us the truth?
I don't. Again, I'm looking for details that we could use as a reason to trust him on this issue. And I appreciate that somewhere in your mind ringing up about the weapons of mass destruction seemed like a good idea, but I'm going to have to steer you back to the conversation that we're actually having. Why do you trust Boris Johnson?
I don't think he believed. I think his mentor was Pericles, who was a great orator.
Not really his mentor, is it?
Well, he
But
has
anyway,
spoken.
why do you trust Boris Johnson? It's a fairly straightforward question, Tony.
I was only saying by comparing him to Tony Blair that I don't trust him.
Right.
I don't trust any ruling politicians unless they're real conviction politicians. I think he's a bit of an actor.
Yes.
And I think he's...
So are you comfortable putting the future of the country in his hands based upon trust, which is what we're being asked to do this week?
Absolutely not. I don't know how anyone could... we don't know if he misled the Queen, but certainly saying that...
Well, we do know that he misled the Queen.
Well, there was he was claiming it was the Queen's speech.
Supreme Court ruled that he had an improper purpose. An improper purpose. Tony, I don't want to sound ungrateful. I register that you can go down on the side of people who don't trust Boris Johnson, but your reasons are a bit odd.
Okay.
Have a great day. Danny's in Reigate. Danny, why do you trust him?
Because he's given the Leavers what they want, and regardless of what that costs.
Why are the DUP against him then?
The DUP are against them because they have their own model.
But they are
Leavers.
Leavers.
The United Kingdom.
They are Leavers, aren't they?
They are Leavers.
So he hasn't given them what they. So he hasn't given them what they want.
He will give them what they want. The DUP are full of rhetoric, and they will come on side when they've been bought enough, when they've been paid enough.
Right.
But, I mean,
so he hasn't given Leavers what they
leave.
want, then? Just to clarify on your first sentence.
Look, the DUP will stand in front of whoever they need to.
He hasn't given Nigel Farage what he wants. Is Nigel Farage a Leaver, do you think?
And Nigel is another, him and his motley crew, because the problem I have with Nigel Farage is he was the one turning the screw, but he's not there to help.
Yeah, so he hasn't given Nigel Farage what he wants. He hasn't given the DUP what he wants. Who are these Leavers you speak of?
I speak of my best friend who wanted to give the political establishment a bloody nose. He didn't care about the economic arguments. He didn't care that we were going to be poorer or my children would suffer. He just wanted to give the elite ruling class a bloody nose.
And does he feel that by putting Boris Johnson, paid, of course, £250,000 a year by the owners of the Ritz Hotel to write a column for the Daily Telegraph, Eton educated and absolutely steeped in the establishment, by putting Boris Johnson in charge of the country's future, does your best friend feel that he has given the establishment, the political establishment, a bloody nose?
Absolutely.
Good grief.
And that's the craziness.
Would you do me a favour, Danny?
Yeah, sure.
Don't let him anywhere near scissors.
I plan not to.
It's 10:30. I suppose there's a short answer to what's going on today, which is it's only 110 pages, get on with it. So, for those of you who like facts, it's a 115-page bill that implements a 541-page agreement, which in turn relates to hundreds of UK and EU pieces of legislation and how each single legal provision is affected by Brexit. Every single one of those impacts has to be got right. It is, according to David Allen Green, whose expertise I draw upon for these observations, immensely complex and time-consuming. They could, of course, have published this bill at any point previous to now, and yet when trying to push it through the Commons in 3 days, they will almost certainly fail to explain why they haven't published it until now, to which the answer is the longer you have to look at it, the more flaws and problems and potential pratfalls will emerge, which is why they're now saying, don't look at it, just pass it. You wouldn't buy a kettle. All right, maybe you'd buy a kettle because it's just in a box. All right, you wouldn't buy an insurance policy for your pets without scrutinising it in more detail than Parliament is being allowed to scrutinise this. Unbelievable. And this word recognise at the top of the... This is really interesting. Part 5, general and final provision, parliamentary sovereignty. Just have a think about this. It is recognised that the Parliament of the United Kingdom is sovereign. Not will be sovereign, not was sovereign, but is sovereign. It is recognised that the Parliament of the United Kingdom is sovereign. So, what was this all about again? Oh, and while we're here, tell me again about our Parliament having no power. Do you see? So all of these things have fallen apart, which is how poor people like the First Lady Turing in Muffy can end up not actually understanding how they've ended up, where they've ended up. It's an astonishing thing to witness, and we witness it on this programme on a daily basis. There are lots of things in the bill that are very, very good for the United Kingdom. It says so in the papers. Could you possibly name one? Oh, stop interrupting me. Well, OK, I'll be quiet. Just name one. Single most significant legislation and future relationships that I think we'll ever see in our lifetime. And they're asking you to wave it through, asking Parliament to wave it through, more or less unexamined. Because what is written down is not even the tip of the iceberg of what Brexit will involve. But they're lying to you again and telling you that this somehow involves getting it done. And people like Muffy believe him. To which my question, very simply, is, what do you base your trust on? Having a look at his personal or professional or both records. Well, what are you reaching for when you say, I really trust this dude? I like the cut of Boris Johnson's jib. I like the fella. What is it that you base your trust upon? Paul is in Bristol. Paul, why do you trust him?
Well, I don't. I don't, and I can't see how anybody can actually trust this guy, because historically and repeatedly he's been proved to lie and be dishonest.
Yes.
And as I said to your researcher just now, so I do worry for the country that there's been this sort of entire element of society that have been conned into a position where one of your callers last week, I think it was completely prepared to suspend his own moral compass, which presumably involved, I don't want people to lie to me. You certainly wouldn't accept your children lying to you. If you've asked them a question, you wouldn't accept your partner lying to you. You wouldn't accept your wife, your employers lying to you. But this guy was, and there's a group that's prepared to, I'll accept all he's done, and prepared to take the fact that he's lied and cheated on the basis that he's going to get this done by the 31st.
And is that what it is? Because I keep looking for the thing, and I've given up trying to be generous, because too much water, as you point out, has passed under the bridge now, and we can try to be generous, but then you come up again and again and again, like the caller you referred to, or the callers that we took earlier this morning, and this is how it works. You give them something, and I hate to say this because it describes people I like. You give them something that spares them the inconvenience of thinking. So we went through this yesterday. It began with take back control. Don't ask what of, don't ask how, don't ask what that means, because we've seen in the bill that Johnson's got today, it says Parliament is sovereign. Always was. Yes. Always was. Arguably, the sovereignty of Parliament is actually now under threat from the executive, but that's a complicated conversation for another day. So we move from take back control to Brexit means Brexit, to no deal is better than a bad deal, and now we're at just get it done. All of which are not just hollow and meaningless. I'd say they are not meaningless, oddly. They're meaningful, and they mean nothing.
Yes.
How has this happened?
I don't... well, I suppose to some extent it all started over the pond with Trump.
It didn't, no. We were doing this before Trump.
Well, yes, I suppose we were.
It's not that.
And I think the press have got a lot to do with it, in the way they've sold certain elements of the press in particular, where they've sold this straight banana fallacy. And
but even that's fallen apart now. So all you're left with now is get it done, but don't ask me what it is. And that is, I mean, it's heartbreaking to see this being done to previously sensible people. Just get it done. What is it? Don't ask me that. Stop interrupting, you traitor.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is scary. I am generally worried for the future of my adult children. And I think there was a recent interview where, and I can't remember the name of the politician, was saying there's no difference in moving the workers' rights from the legislative part to the political part. And
no, Dominic Raab said they were doing it in order to enhance workers' rights. So we're making the protection of workers' rights non-legally binding in order to enhance the protection of workers' rights. I mean, that's freedom is slavery territory, isn't it?
Absolutely, but they've got to do that if they want this trade deal with America. The only way it's going to, or even any other part of the world, because we aren't a huge colonial country anymore.
How dare you? Stop talking the country down. How dare you?
Well, I know, but we are a small and relatively insignificant island because we don't have any natural resources.
Not a great deal of manufacturing either. We're very big on services, financial services, and hopefully intellectual property, all these sort of things in the future. But you know, the amazing thing. Go on, Paul. Sorry.
If we're going to do this trade, the only way it's going to work really is that we have an incredibly cheap workforce that doesn't matter if they get killed at work because the health and safety has been eroded. And I come from a health and safety background. I worked for the fire brigade. I've been retired 3 years.
Okay.
And I saw Boris Johnson stand up the other day, and it irritates me immensely when people refer to health and safety as health and safety.
Yes.
Especially people in command, and in power, like Boris Johnson, because it completely undermines what health and safety is all about.
Of course.
And I think the workforce has lost the sight that it's there to protect you. Like you had a guy on that was concerned he didn't want to wear a bump hat. I was talking about
I think that might have been on someone else's show. I think that was. I think I had to share the spoils of viral hits that day. So someone else got that particular genius. But I'm familiar with it. Why did you vote to leave the European Union? Because I don't want to wear a hard hat on a building site.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's just okay. Well, it
sounds like he's already had quite a heavy hit on the head.
Really, if that's really what you want, sign a piece of paper. So when we go if we go out and we do, and it's the nightmare that we expect it to, you that voted leave because there's a huge food shortages, medicine shortages, you voted for this, you sign this piece of paper and you get to the back of the queue because this is what you voted for. And let the people that didn't vote for it stand at the front because this is what we voted for.
I mean, you and I obviously sing from the same hymn sheet where I tell you what we are, Paul, we're just sort of condescending, sneering Ramonas because we think health is quite important and safety is a good thing.
Absolutely.
Down with us. I bet you believe in human rights as well, don't you fool?
Absolutely. Just outrageous.
Absolutely.
The health and safety point that Boris Johnson was trying to make the other day is too onerous. It's only onerous when you get it wrong and you don't do it properly. If you put all the steps in place to start with, people shouldn't get injured at work.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put, but down with those steps to stop people getting injured at work. And anyway, how can we possibly know what Dominic Raab actually thinks about British workers? It's not like he co-authored a book with Liz Truss and Priti Patel which described them as among the idlest in the world, is it? What? Oh, sorry. Apparently he did. I'm very, very drawn to this story for a heap of reasons, which if you've been kind enough to listen to this programme for a while, you probably already know. But the idea that the first 7 words you speak in a job interview could determine the success or failure of that interview it's an astonishing bit of research. A person's speech patterns shape the way people perceive them, including assessing their competence and fitness for a job. I'm probably going to have a little look later in the programme at how class still holds people back. And, you look at, again, the lens of Brexit. It's astonishing how many posh people, or even pseudo-posh people, are on one side of the argument, isn't it? It is really strange to me that it ever successfully got sold as something that was somehow a working class movement. Brexit was carried over the line by largely retired right-wing voters in the southeast of England. You know, this idea that that people who were already low on the socio-economic ladder somehow voted to be lower. Really offensive. They voted to be higher because they believed the people that told them their lives would improve. Now they're trying to mask it as we just wanted to give the establishment a bloody nose. Very sad to see it happening. And the Northamptonshire Police giving a press conference at the moment. We should catch up with its content shortly. This story, oh man, I told you it stank, didn't I, a couple of weeks ago. It now emerges that the American diplomat's wife fled the country, and the Foreign Office knew. And instructions were given to the local police force not to tell the family of Harry Dunn that she'd fled the country, the 19-year-old who was killed on his bike, until after she'd gone. And, you know, I sometimes struggle. One of the things, I was listening to Nick this morning, talking about William Shakespeare, and one of the things about literature and art that I think people often miss during times of complacency and calm. Why do fascists hate literature? Why do fascists burn books? Why do fascists hate art and intellectuals? It's really simple. Fascists hate intellectuals because art involves imagination, right? Thinking, but mostly imagination. Art opens up your imagination. Imagine what it would be like to be Hamlet, or imagine what it would be like to be Holden Caulfield, or imagine what it would be like to be Jon Snow in Game of Thrones. You know, it's all art, lowbrow, highbrow, middlebrow. It teaches you imagination. It trains your imagination. Now, what is the greatest gift an imagination can give you as a member of a society? Answer, an inkling of what it would be like to walk a mile in someone else's shoes. Okay? What's that called? That's called empathy. What is, historically, the garlic to the vampirism of fascism? Answer, empathy. You cannot go along with politics that divides and conquers if you have empathy. If you were a German living in the 1930s and you had strong powers of empathy, you couldn't have gone along with the Holocaust. You simply couldn't have done it. It's not enough to say, well, I'm not Jewish, I'm not gay, I'm not a socialist, I'm not a trades unionist, I'm not a Roma, so I'm fine with it. Some people without empathy could do that, and also people with empathy who'd been terrified into cooperation could do that. But empathy is the greatest enemy imaginable of totalitarianism in general and fascism in particular. So that's why you have a suspicion of intellectualism or a burning of books among that kind of politics. And that is why, of course, the imagination is the single most important thing we can feed in our lives. So we'll probably have a little look at that a little later in the programme as well. But for now, it's all about Brexit. And the question is, why do you trust Boris Johnson, given that the most cursory glance at his track record would throw up a lot of reasons not to trust him? Marriage vows, Garden Bridge, water cannon, 350 million quid a week, breaking electoral law, misleading the Queen, suspending Parliament unlawfully. I mean, even while he's been Prime Minister, there's loads of reasons. Before that, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. And the point I was making about empathy in the context of Harry Dunn was this. The way to make that story sing, that tragedy resonate, is to imagine it was your 19-year-old. That's all. Your 19-year-old, minding his own business, riding his motorbike, legally, correctly, dead. Because a woman was on the wrong side of the road. And she gets spirited out of the country, and the Foreign Office knew. It's a terrible story. 10:54 is the time. I have a couple of phone lines free. Make of that what you will. Okay, people ringing in to tell me why they trust Boris Johnson have arguably... I thought Nick was very rude to the first caller. But people ringing in to explain why they trust Boris Johnson are incredibly thin on the ground, which is the point, because you still do think you would in company say, I like him, I trust him. And you're not going to ring me and tell me why, because you know what I'll ask you. Why do you trust him? And that's when it all falls apart. I've read in the newspaper that what he's doing is great. Which newspaper? Well, the one that is owned by the Barclay brothers. The fellows who own the Ritz and paid him £250,000 a year to write newspaper. Oh, okay, that's trustworthy, is it? Ooh, well, that'll teach the elites. That's a bloody nose, isn't it, for the elites? Paul's in Bow. Paul, what would you like to say?
Well, James, you do love the sound of your own voice. I've been hanging on for 10 minutes.
Do you know what, Paul? I can't bear the sound of yours. Sorry. Adam's in Winchester. Adam, what would you like to say?
I think it's very difficult for anyone to trust Boris Johnson at the moment, whether you'll leave or remain, due to the speed at which he's trying to ram through this legislation. There's elements in it that are going to annoy the ERG as well. For example, the fact that we have to start paying that 39 billion back as soon as we leave, as opposed to when we get a free trade agreement, which I think what they wanted.
It's lower than that now. We've already paid a lot of it. Well, a lot. I think it's around the 31 billion pound mark. But all the things they claim, this is the point you're making, I think, all the things they claim to care about, they have to now pretend that they never cared about at all. Or maybe they were lying when they said that they did care about them.
Well, this is the thing, and they need, all sides need to give this proper scrutiny. And the reason why I called, actually, I came across a tweet that was sent back in May by Nikki DaCosta, who was Boris Johnson's ex-legislative director.
Right.
And in the thread, she was talking about bringing in the Withdrawal Act bill at that point, and there she was discussing a hypothetical deadline of 30th of June. And I just thought the tweet was brilliant because it sums up the situation for me. And she said, the legislation is going to need more than 4 weeks, and even mentioning a hypothetical deadline of 30th of June is like offering a deadline to client that you think they want to hear, even when you know you cannot possibly deliver. And obviously, you just need to change one date.
I think there's another bit to that. I think it might have been a thread. Supposing the deal passes, then you introduce the WAB straight away, which is what is happening now. And supposing you use the EU Withdrawal Act as a template for how much time for scrutiny, then you need 13 days in the Common and close to 20 in the Lords, and then 4 in ping pong. So that's 37 days.
Yeah,
and they're trying to do it in 3. And that is, as you point out, that is his own consigliere.
But I mean, obviously, Remainers are going to throw their arms in the air and have arguments about the timescale. But I think even those who oppose Brexit. Even those who support Brexit are going to have issues with some of the things in there. It needs scrutiny. And as you pointed out earlier, when the Institute of Government, who are an impartial body, are coming out saying no MP should vote for this timescale, it really tells you something.
Well, I mean, again, what's the word? I mean, the bounds of my credulity have been stretched to breaking point, because you're absolutely right. This is Boris Johnson's current legislative advisor tweeting in May that it would take at least 4 weeks to get what is currently being they're trying to force through in 3 days. She explains why it would take more than 4 weeks, which leads us to this question, doesn't it? I think inevitably, Adam, why don't they want us to scrutinise it more?
Well, exactly. I mean, the draft legislation has been available for 12 months. Now, admittedly, some elements of it have only changed in the last kind of 3 or 4 weeks. But why on earth wasn't this brought in earlier?
Well, you answer the question. You answer the question. No, just from Adam's own single perspective, not claiming that this is the universal objective answer, but if it's all been available for 12 months, why haven't we been allowed to see it?
Because there are elements in it that are contentious to both Remainers and Leavers, and this is exactly why. Push it through, create this arbitrary deadline, which is nonsense, and use the pressure of time to try and ram it through.
And I mean, in a nutshell, why aren't we allowed to see what's in it? Because then we'd know what it is that they're urging us to get done. And the minute you know what it is, the idea of getting it done super quickly is revealed for the nonsense that it clearly is. But hey, there's stuff in the paper about why it's a great idea, and Boris Johnson is a legend, Adam. So you really need to get back in your box.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, this is Brexit defined now. This is what was in the box, and before. People could, speculate about what it is and what isn't. Now, this is Brexit, and we've got a day to debate it. It's absurd.
I know. And it's not even Brexit, but we just need to get it done. Why? Well, because, look, I'm on commission. If you don't buy this car, I won't be able to go away for the weekend. So just don't look under the bonnet. Sign here. Thank you very much. Oh, and by the way, while you're here, would you like some finance on that car? Yeah, sign here as well. Can I just read the... No, just trust me. It's absolutely fine. Don't look under the bonnet. Just get it done. Just get it done.